Holy Gospel according to Matthew. On that day, Jesus went out of the house and sat down by the sea. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat down, and the whole crowd stood on the shore. As he spoke to them at length in parables, saying, "A sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seed fell on the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky ground, where it had little soil. It sprang up at once because the soil was not deep. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and it withered for lack of roots. Some seed fell among thorns, and then the thorns grew up and choked it. But some seed fell on rich soil and produced fruit, 100 or 60 or 30-fold. Whoever has ears ought to hear." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
This is a pretty popular parable that you're probably all familiar with, and with pretty good reason, because it appears in 3 out of 4 Gospels in our Bible. It appears in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And it's so popular, it also appears in a Gospel that's not part of our Bible. It's in the Gospel of Thomas. So the people that wrote the Gospels must have thought that this parable from Jesus must have been a very sort of important parable. And I think they thought it was important, and most scholars think it's important, because it talks about something about why us as human beings don't accept the invitation of God's relation with us. There's something about us. And because it's so popular, and because it says something about our humanity and relationship with God, I want to talk a little bit about it. The word humanity itself comes from the Latin root humanus, which means earth. So, as I looked at this parable, the most important part of the parable to me is not the sower, and it's not the seed, but it's the soil, the earth. I think the message of this parable lies in the soil. And before we get our hands dirty into this parable, I wanted to talk about 2 things that will help us understand it. One thing is that farming in Jesus' day was a little bit different than it is today. Back farming in Jesus' day, they threw the seed first and then plowed the fields. Today we plow the fields and put the seed right where we need it to be. So that's why this story would not have sounded that odd to the people of that day. And whether it was in Jesus' day or today, we have to understand that we will have to plow the field for the seed to take hold. So that's the second thing I want you to recall as I talk about it, is that there has to be some kind of plowing or the seed won't take hold. Now in the story, there's 3 types of seed that's planted onto 3 types of soil. The first type of soil, if you remember, was on the path, which is hardened down. To me, the hardened down path represents people who start their lives with an open heart. They come into lives hoping that their relationships will give them satisfaction. They pour their heart out. But then something terrible happens in their lives. Whether it be a death, or a divorce, or an addiction, or they marry somebody with alcoholism, or they get alcoholism themselves, something terrible happens that they close their heart completely. And they form like a hard shell. Because the path in this story is nothing more than stamped down dirt. And they form that hard shell so that they'll never be hurt again. A perfect example of this that I thought overnight that we'll all recognize is Ebenezer Scrooge from the Christmas Carol. If you remember, he has this hard shell and nothing will penetrate it. You can still accept the Word of God and the invitation from God, even if you have that hard shell, but it has to really be deeply plowed. And if you remember the story of the Christmas Carol, there was a lot of plowing that he had to do. In fact, he had to see his own death before he realized that his life could be different. So that seeds of God's invitation that are plowed on that hard surface can even accept it when it gets plowed deeply. The second type of seed that we saw was a seed that was planted on rocky soil. To me, this represents people who know that intimate relationships will hurt, so they don't want them. And they will meet with people superficially, and they'll have all the joy and pleasure of a relationship, but as soon as there's a challenge or there's some type of pain in that relationship, they bolt, they run, and they don't want that. They don't realize that it is the experience and the acceptance of that pain that causes the joy of any relationship. Another perfect example of a person like this is Scarlett from Gone with the Wind. If you remember Scarlett, it was during the time of the collapse of the South during the Civil War. And throughout all this tragedy, she pretended like all these things weren't happening. And she had that famous line that I'm going to give you, but this is my first time of imitating a female from the South. She said, "I'll go crazy if I think about that today. I'll think about that tomorrow." So if you remember, just think of when you think of a person with that rocky soil, that very soft soil, it's somebody like Scarlett who doesn't want to get deeply involved. In our second reading, St. Paul's description of the pain that people have to endure for an intimate relationship with God, he describes it as childbirth. He talks about it, he said, "We who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan within ourselves like a childbirth," like in childbirth. Now, I've never had childbirth, but I've been a pediatrician for 25 years, so I've seen plenty, let me tell you. And I find that it's no wonder that the offer of a divine relationship scares a lot of people. But for those who have taken the risk and have gone through childbirth, they understand that sweet pain and that joy, that as God calls you, He knows that you're going to have to give up some stuff that you love to follow Him. And there's pain in that. And some people, like Scarlett, don't want to give up that, and they don't want to go through that pain. So that's the second group of people. What you have to do if you're in that situation is you've got to clean away the rocks. You've got to make the soil better. Now, I've helped set up a farm for planting, and I've gone behind the tractor bed as we walk, and you pick up the rocks, and you throw them on the bed, and you clean up everything from all the rocks that got pushed up on the season before. It's not pleasant work, but it does work, and it makes the field fertile for the seed. The third one is the thorns. And this is the one that's most difficult for me because this one is the one that's most real for me. These are people that have very good intentions. They understand that relationships cause pain and they're willing to work with it. But as they grow, they make compromises through their whole lives, and the things they accumulate in their lives begin to choke off that understanding and that feeling. They forget that their lives are not all about them. They entangle themselves in worldly pleasures, and they forget the spiritual, and they forget that life is about God and other people. The love that they have in their relationships and their families suffer, and sometimes they suffer in ways that cannot be fixed. The best way to treat this is to pull the weeds when they're small. But if the weeds grow big and they entangle the good seeds, then you can pull the weeds, but you'll sometimes pull some of the good seeds along with it and the good plants. When, because of our wickedness, that we lose the trust of our family and our friends, there is damage there that you can't rebuild and you can't fix. And I think the only way it will ever be fixed is not in this world, but in the next. One of my brothers has a really nice home, but he lives an hour and a half from work. He works plenty of evenings and a lot of weekends, and he's never home with his family to enjoy it. This supposed life of comfort that he has sacrificed his family for. The lure of these things satisfy the hunger for meaning, but you just end up to continue to feed these things because your hunger for meaning, its only answer is God. And if you feed it with worldly things, you just end up feeding it all the time. When you finally stop feeding it, you look back and things have changed, and sometimes forever. This is hard for me because I really should not have talked to you about my brother. But it was easier for me to talk about him than to talk about myself. But here goes. I've been married twice. My daughters were young when I divorced my first wife. That was over 20 years ago. My undiscerned decision to get married, my failed attempts at making my first marriage work, and my rationalization that there is such a thing as a good divorce scarred my 3 girls forever. I can't change that. When I finally got around to pulling my weeds, some good plans got damaged. But even I was offered God's redemption. The joy of this parable is that all 3 of the seedlings can bear fruit. They're not lost. When God plants his seeds, in order to grow, all the soils will need to be turned up. And that's the work that we need to do. The soil is made for the seed and for growing. We are made for relationship with God. In the first reading, God promises that if you till the soil, remove the rocks, pull the weeds, I will water that soil and seed, and you will produce good fruit. Maybe you resonate with one of these soils, or maybe you know somebody that does. No matter which it is, take the chance, till your soil, churn up which is hidden, be vulnerable to God. Let the word grow in you and bear fruit, and it will exceed all your expectations, and you will be sweet fruit for other people.
Let us now profess our faith together. I believe in one God, the Father